Once upon a time in the Grand Kingdom of England, there lived a king named Henry VIII. He was a tall, strong ruler with big dreams for his kingdom. In the year 1509, King Henry married a lovely Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was gracefully beautiful, with red gold hair that shined like the sun, and she wore a golden gable hood that crowned her head like a queen. For several years, King Henry and Queen Catherine ruled together, but in 1516, everything began to change. That year, Queen Catherine gave birth to a baby girl named Mary. King Henry was disappointed because he had hoped for a baby boy who would one day take his place as king. Meanwhile, King Henry found himself falling in love with a lady named Anne Boleyn, who had brown hair and wore a charming red French hood. Even though he loved Anne, King Henry couldn't marry her because he was still married to Queen Catherine. Determined, King Henry asked the Pope, who was the leader of the Catholic Church, for a divorce. However, the Pope said no, which made King Henry very mad. Feeling frustrated, King Henry decided to make a big change. He broke away from the Catholic Church and formed his own church, where he could make the rules. In 1533, King Henry finally divorced Queen Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. Queen Catherine was heartbroken, as she loved the king dearly. She found solace by spending her days praying and helping others like a nun. After a few years, sadly, Queen Catherine grew very sick and passed away from an illness. She left behind her beloved daughter, Mary Tudor, who missed her mother greatly. As life moved on, things also changed for Anne Boleyn. Though she tried to be a good queen, in 1536, she faced her own sad fate. Anne Boleyn was accused of treason, which means being disloyal to the king, and was executed at the Tower of London. This is the tale of Catherine of Aragon, a queen who was loved by her people and cherished her daughter, Princess Mary. It's a story of love, change, and the strong bonds between a mother and her child. Once upon a time, in the early 1500s, there lived a beautiful lady named Anne Boleyn, and was known for her striking brown hair, which she often wore with a black and yellow French hood, and a black veil flowing gracefully down her back. She was born in the year 1501. Anne's journey began when she traveled to the UK in 1522, where she captured the attention of King Henry VIII. The moment King Henry set his eyes on Anne, he was smitten. He loved her so much that he wanted to marry her, but there was one big problem. King Henry was already married to Queen Catherine. In those days, only the Pope could say if a king's marriage could be ended, and the Pope said no to King Henry's request to divorce Catherine. But King Henry was so determined to marry, and that he made a very big decision. In 1533, he broke away from the entire Catholic Church. This was a huge deal back then and changed England forever. After breaking with the church, King Henry divorced Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. Everyone hoped Anne would give birth to a boy, an heir to the throne, but she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Elizabeth instead. King Henry was not pleased and began to look at other women, like Jane Seymour, who had blonde hair and a light orange gable hood. Anne noticed King Henry's wandering eyes and became very jealous. She tried to make him jealous too, by flirting with other men. When King Henry found out, he was furious. He lost his temper, yelling and shouting at Anne. In a moment of anger, King Henry decided that Anne must be punished severely. He ordered that Anne should be locked in the dungeons. Then, in 1536, Anne faced a very sad ending. She was taken to the execution site, where she bravely kneeled down and prayed. The swordsman then swung his sword, and Anne Boleyn was executed. Not long after, King Henry married Jane Seymour, and as for the little girl Anne left behind, she grew up to be Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest queens England has ever known. This is the tragic story of Anne Boleyn, full of love, betrayal, and historical change. Once upon a time, In a very big and fancy castle, there lived a lady named Jane Seymour. She had pretty blonde hair and liked wearing a special hat called a gable hood, which was yellow and light orange. Jane was born in 1508, a long, long time ago. Growing up, Jane was known for being kind and gentle. One day, she met a king named Henry VIII. King Henry was very important and very famous, and he had fallen madly in love with Jane. But there was a tiny problem. You see, Jane worked for another queen named Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn had short brown hair and wore a different type of hat called a French hood, with a black and yellow color and a long black veil at the back. Anne was quite nice to everyone, especially people who were not so wealthy. But despite Anne's kindness, her life took a sad turn. In 1536, Anne Boleyn faced a terrible fate. She was executed, which means she was put to death by the king's orders. King Henry didn't seem to mind because he quickly set his sights on marrying Jane Seymour. So, King Henry and Jane Seymour got married, and in 1537, Jane was going to have a baby. But King Henry warned Jane to be careful because he remembered what had happened when Anne had a daughter before him. Jane was a little scared, but she bravely went on. Luckily, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy boy named Edward, who made King Henry very happy. However, a sad shadow fell over this joyful time because Jane became very sick after having Edward, and unfortunately, she died. King Henry was so sad about losing Jane that he decided she would always be his favorite wife. But life carried on, and he married again. When he married his fourth wife, Henry was not happy because he thought she was not as pretty as Jane. Legend has it that Jane Seymour's spirit felt sorry for the new queen. As a kind ghost, she comforted the fourth wife to stop her from feeling sad. And that is the story of Jane Seymour, a lady who is known for her kindness and adventures in the complex world of kings and queens. Once upon a time, in the 16th century, there was a lady named Anne of Cleves. She was born in 1515 into a powerful family in Germany, and had orange hair, and often wore a red headdress called a stickelchen, which looked like a square-shaped cap. Even though she came from a noble background, her education was not like others we know of today. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry VIII from the famous Tudor family was on the lookout for a new wife. He had already been married several times, as was the custom for kings to have heirs, and now he was searching for someone new. When King Henry met Anne for the first time, he was disappointed because he didn't find her as beautiful as he had hoped. Despite his initial feelings, in the year 1540, King Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves. Behind the scenes, the king's advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who had helped arrange the marriage, was blamed for its failure. Sadly, Cromwell was executed in the Tower of London. However, King Henry's heart soon wandered. He met a young lady named Catherine Howard, who had brown hair and wore a special French hood covered with a black veil. The king fell in love with Catherine and, ignoring his marriage to Anne, started spending much time with her, and was heartbroken to see this. One day, in a moment of anger and heartbreak, Anne of Cleves slapped King Henry. This was all Henry needed to decide that he wanted to divorce Anne. He went ahead and married Catherine Howard. Though Anne was left alone after the divorce, she was given a nice house to live in. Still, she felt sad and lonely about how things turned out. Her marriage had ended, and her dream of being queen had slipped away. On January 1st, 1541, Anne watched as Catherine Howard took her place as queen, feeling a mixture of emotions. Though her life didn't turn out as she planned, Anne of Cleves continued to live, seeking contentment in other things. This was the story of Anne of Cleves, a woman who was briefly a queen and who lived a quiet life after her time at the royal court ended. Once upon a time, in the United Kingdom, a little girl named Catherine Howard was born. She had brown hair and often wore a black and white French hood. Sadly, When Catherine was very young, she lost her mother and was taken care of by her loving grandmother, Agnes Howard. As she grew older, Catherine became a beautiful young lady. Her life took a big turn when she crossed paths with the mighty King Henry VIII, who was captivated by her charm. Henry fell head over heels and decided to marry Catherine. Before this, King Henry was married to Anne of Cleves, who had bright orange hair and wore a unique red headdress shaped like a squire's cap. Anne and Catherine were friendly, and was always nice to young Catherine. However, King Henry decided to divorce and marry Catherine instead. In 1541, a year after their marriage, Catherine made a grave mistake. She fell for another man, Thomas Cromwell, and had a secret relationship with him. When King Henry discovered this betrayal, he was heartbroken and angry. Catherine's actions led her to a dreadful fate. In 1542, she was imprisoned, and it was decided that she would be executed. Though Catherine was scared, she showed bravery at the end. Standing before a crowd, she thought of her cousin and Bullen, who had faced a similar fate. With her last words, Catherine remained strong. She lay her head on the block as everyone watched in silence. The executioner lifted the big axe, and Catherine Howard was beheaded at the tender age of 18. Her story, like a cautionary tale, reminds us of the turbulent lives of those who lived in the court of King Henry VIII. Once upon a time, in the land of England, there was a lady named Catherine Parr. She had black short hair and always wore a white bonnet and coif, with a dark red dress. Catherine was a clever and kind woman. Catherine lived in a time when King Henry VIII ruled the kingdom. King Henry was known for having many wives, some of whom had very sad endings. Despite knowing about King Henry's past with his wives, one day, he met Catherine and fell in love. Henry wanted Catherine to be his new queen. Catherine was worried. She knew what happened to King Henry's other wives, and she was afraid of saying yes to him. But King Henry was determined, and in 1543, he married Catherine Parr. Catherine was a clever lady and knew how to make the best of her situation. She was very kind to Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. She taught them about many important things, like reading and history. She wanted them to learn and be strong like her. When Catherine looked out of the window, she often saw Mary, who had shiny red gold hair, playing with Elizabeth, who had bright orange hair. Catherine cared for them and tried to be a good stepmother, even though Henry didn't care much because the girls' mothers were no longer in his favor. In 1547, King Henry VIII passed away. While the rest of the kingdom was relieved from his rule, Catherine Parr survived and was happy to see a new beginning. People in England breathed a sigh of relief because they were free from the king's tough reign. Sadly, in 1548, just a year after King Henry's death, Catherine Parr passed away too. She left behind Mary Tudor and Elizabeth Tudor, two young girls who she had loved and educated. Her kindness and wisdom had a lasting impact on them. And that, my young friends, is the story of Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII, who brought a touch of kindness and wisdom to a time filled with worry and change. A long time ago in England, there was a king named Henry VIII who had 6 wives. Let me tell you about the story of each one of them. Henry's first wife was Catherine of Aragon. She had red gold hair and wore a beautiful golden hood. They married in 1509 and were happy at first. In 1516, they had a daughter named Mary Tudor. But Henry really wanted a son to be the next king and got upset because Catherine didn't give him one. In 1533, Henry decided to divorce Catherine and marry a lady named Anne Boleyn, and had brown hair and wore a French hood with a black veil. They soon had a daughter named Elizabeth. Once again, Henry was disappointed because he was still hoping for a boy. Sadly, in 1536, Anne Boleyn was accused of serious crimes and was executed, which means she was beheaded. After Anne, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane had blonde hair and wore a light orange hood. In 1537, she gave birth to a boy named Edward. Henry was finally happy to have a son, but Jane died soon after giving birth. In 1540, Henry married Anne of Cleves, who had orange hair, but Henry didn't like and thought she was not pretty, so he divorced her shortly after. Then came Catherine Howard, who had brown hair. Catherine wore a white and black French hood, but in 1541, Henry found out that Catherine was not being faithful to him, and she, too, was beheaded in 1542. King Henry's last wife was Catherine Parr. She had short black hair and wore a white bonnet. Catherine Parr was kind and cared for Henry until he died in 1547. This is the story of King Henry and his 6 wives. Each one has a tale of her own, full of pretty clothes, grand castles, and life at the king's court.